Part 1, recording macros. Hey, have you ever recorded a macro? How'd that work for you? Did it work the next day when you had more records or less records? I bet the answer is no. Here's why. The macro recorder starts with one very annoying default setting. If Microsoft would have changed this default, people would have much better success with the macro recorder. In these lessons, I'm going to show you how to change that setting, which tools to completely avoid, and workarounds so that way you can get useful code. Let's get started.
Lesson 1. Enable the Developer tab. In this lesson, we'll take a look at how in Excel 2007 you can get access to all of the Visual Basic tools and how to adjust macro security so that way you're able to do macros. Well, as you know, in Excel 2007, Microsoft redesigned the interface. They moved a lot of things around to various tabs on the ribbon, and in certain cases, they removed items from the ribbon. Well, with our Visual Basic tools, there are a few tools here on the right side of the View tab. You can record a new macro, control relative references, and also view a list of macros, but this is far from the complete list. Microsoft took most of the macro tools and moved them to a new tab called the Developer tab. Unfortunately, this tab is not turned on by default. It's easy enough to get it back, and once you turn it on, it'll be on for you all the time. To start, we're going to go to the menu formerly known as File, the Office icon in the top left-hand corner, and then in the lower right-hand corner of the File menu, choose Excel Options. Excel options are now grouped into 9 categories along the left-hand side, but what we need is right here on the very first category. It's the third checkbox called Show Developer tab in the ribbon. Click OK. You now have a brand new tab called Developer. What do we have on this tab? The first icon will get us into the Visual Basic Editor. The second icon, the Macros icon, will get us a list of all of the macros. That's like pressing Alt F8. We have tools to record a macro, use relative references, and also macro security. We'll visit that in a minute. Finally, in the next group, we have the form controls and the ActiveX controls. Now, in the old version of Excel, this was 2 different toolbars. You would have gotten there by using View Toolbars Forms or View Toolbars ActiveX control box. One of the other things you're going to have to do if you want to record macros is to change the default security setting. To do this, click on Macro Security in the Developer tab, and you'll see that there are now 4 options. Now, there were 4 options before that used to be called Low, Medium, High, and Very High. They've changed those words, and in my mind, they've made them a bit more confusing. If you want to use the equivalent of medium, which is what Microsoft recommends, then we want to go to the second option. It's called Disable All Macros with Notification. Now, when you open a workbook that has macros, you will be able to enable the macros by choosing an item in the info bar. If you left it with Disable All Macros without notification, the macros would be disabled and you would have no way to enable them. The method that they don't recommend, and this is equivalent to low in Excel 2003, was to enable all macros. In this case, you're not even alerted when a macro is there, and there's a chance that you're going to open an Excel file from someone which has a malicious virus. So disable all macros with notification is the method that I recommend. Click OK. If you're going to be doing a lot of macros, another option that you might want to look at is how you save files. You know, if we go to File, Save As, there's now 4 different file types. The Excel workbook is the XLSX file extension, and then the XLSM is a macro-enabled workbook. Now, both of these use the new XML method for saving the file. The difference is the XLSX cannot have macros, and the XLSM can have macros. You see here in the icon, they give you the little exclamation point, like they're trying to scare people away. Oh no, this file might have macros. But frankly, if you're going to be doing macros all the time, it might be best just to choose that method for saving your files. to change the type of file that you use all the time, we want to open the Office button, go into Excel options, and then choose the Save category. Save files in this format. You have a choice between the XLSX and XLSM. And again, if you're going to be doing macros all the time, it's best just to set that to XLSM. That way, all of the Excel files that you create have the ability to have macros added to them. If you have an XLSX file, you're not going to be able to record a macro unless you save it as XLSM. So this is just a great way to make sure that you can always add a macro to any workbook that you have. Well, that's just a quick first step to make sure that you're able to run macros and to see all of the tools in the Developer tab. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at how to record your first macro. I hope you found that helpful, and thanks for watching. Lesson 2, Recording Your First Macro. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the options in the Record Macro dialog. How to pick a good macro name, how to assign your macro to a shortcut key, and how to choose where to store your macro. So macros are good when you have to automate a series of tasks. Maybe you have 4 or 5 steps and you'd like to reduce those 4 or 5 steps down to a single keystroke. For example, I was doing a seminar in Chicago and someone there said, hey, look, we have this situation where we have to choose cells that we're going to audit. We have to mark these records for audit. And the company standard says that we're going to take that number and put it in bold. So we choose the bold icon. And then we change the font color from the regular color to a blue color. We change the background of the cell to a light blue. And then we go in and change the borders. Now, the borders that are available to us in the borders drop-down aren't good enough, so we always have to go in to basically format cells, go back to the border tab, choose a thick border, choose dark blue, and put that border on the top and bottom of the cell. And he says, it takes me forever to go through and do all of these steps. It would be great if I could basically apply this format in a single keystroke. And that's what a macro is perfect at doing. So we can turn on the macro recorder and record the steps of doing those 5 commands and then play them back by using a shortcut key. If you want to work along, I want you to select one cell, and it's very important that while you're recording the macro that you do not select any other cells. I want you to select a cell first. We're going to turn on the macro recorder, do all the steps to that cell, and then turn off the macro recorder without choosing any other cells. So we choose our one cell, and we're going to go back to the Developer tab in the ribbon, and we're going to use the Record Macro button. Now I'll point out that the Record Macro button is actually in 3 places in the interface. It's here on the Developer tab. It's also down in the status bar, and it's also on the right side of the View tab under the Macros drop-down, Record Macro. All 3 of these icons are exactly identical, so you can use any of them that you like. We'll choose Record Macro, and that's how we get to the Record Macro dialog box. Now, a few things we have to decide here. First of all, the macro name. Now, one rule with macro names is that you cannot use any spaces in the macro name. So I would really like to call this macro Format Blue. We certainly don't want to call it Macro 1 because as you start recording more and more macros, then you're just going to have a series of macros called Macro 1, Macro 2, Macro 3, and it'll be hard several months from now to remember exactly what it was that Macro 1 or Macro 6 did. So we always want to give it a descriptive name. And because we're not allowed to use a space, what I do is I put it in something called camel case. Camel case capitalizes the first letter of each word but leaves the spaces out. So there you can see Format Blue. And because the B in blue is capitalized, well, it's easy enough to see that that's a second word, and it helps with readability. Shortcut key. Now the shortcut key is the way to invoke the macro very quickly. If you think about it, Format Blue, well, Control B would be a great shortcut key, except that Control B is already used. Control B is what? Bold. And if we would assign this macro to be Control B, well, then anyone who uses this workbook will keep hitting Control B to try and do bold, and it would apply all this formatting. That wouldn't be a good situation at all. As you look at the letters on the keyboard, most of those letters are already assigned to shortcut keys. For example, Control C for cut, Control S for save, Control I for italics. It turns out the only two that are available are K and L. And you have to decide, okay, with only two shortcut keys left, do I really want to use one of those up? And plus, how will Control K or Control L ever make me think of Format Blue? Well, the solution here is that the shifted shortcut keys are all available. So if you want to hold down Shift and press B, then you're assigning it to a shortcut key of Control Shift B, still easy enough to hit, and we're good to go. The next question, where do we want to store the macro? Do we store it in this workbook, in a new workbook, or in something called the Personal Macro Workbook? Well, if you would store the macro in this workbook, it would only be available when this workbook is open. If this is something that you're going to have to do in every workbook that you're ever working in, or in many workbooks that you're ever working in, this would be a great macro to store in the Personal Macro Workbook. The Personal Macro Workbook is a hidden workbook that gets opened every time that you open an Excel, and it's a great place to store all of your macros. The description, this is completely optional, but it will help if months from now you come back and say, well, what the heck was I doing? What does the Format Blue macro do? There you go. That's a suitable description. Okay, now we want to plan out our steps, and in this case, it's going to be relatively easy. We're going to go back to the Home tab. We're going to use the bold icon, dark blue font, light blue background, and then go into the Format Cells dialog box to access the borders. Again, remember, once we click OK, the macro recorder is on. We don't want to do anything else. We don't want to be interrupted. We don't want to have the phone ring. We don't want to have our manager come in and ask us to go open some other file, because all of those steps would get recorded in the macro. So we'd really like a nice, perfect, uninterrupted 30 seconds of silence while we record this macro. Also, I want to remind you not to select another cell. Whatever cell you have selected, I want you to format that particular cell. So here, I'm formatting F4. That's the cell that I'm going to format. So I click OK. The macro recorder is actually running. The only indication we have that the macro recorder is running, on the Developer tab, the recording button changes to Stop Recording. Also down here in the status bar, the Record Macro icon changes to a square. Basically, this is kind of like the Stop button on a VCR. Okay, so we're going to go back to the Home tab. We're going to choose the bold icon. By the way, you could use Control B instead of using the icon. I'll use the light blue background, the dark blue font. I'm going to use the dialog launcher in the font group to open the Format Cells dialog. We'll go to border, choose the thick border, choose dark blue, and then apply that to the top and bottom of the range. Click OK, and you see that our cell is now perfectly formatted. Again, we don't want to select another cell while we're recording the macro. Simply come down here and click Stop Recording, and we should be good to go. We now have recorded our first macro. It's time to test it. So let's go select another cell and press the shortcut key, Control Shift B, and sure enough, it plays back those steps, and in one keystroke, we've done the 5 commands. That's the basics of the macro recorder. You have a series of steps. You'd like to automate those steps and have Excel do them very quickly in response to one command. That's what a macro will do. So you can try this. You can choose another cell, Control Shift B, choose another cell, Control Shift B, and so on. It's interesting. What would happen if you just selected a bunch of cells? Control Shift B. Well, take a look. The macro recorder successfully put them in bold. It successfully changed the font color and the background color, but it only put the border on the top and bottom of the range, because that's what we did when we were recording the individual cell in the macro recorder. Okay, so there you have it, your very first macro. Remember, to start the macro recorder, we go to the Developer tab and use Record Macro, or the Record Macro button down here. Choose a macro name that's meaningful, but it can't have any spaces. Think about your shortcut keys. Remember, the shifted shortcut keys are all available to you. And then the big decision, do we want to store this so that way the macro is only available when this workbook is open, or when it's available for all workbooks? In that case, it goes to the personal macro workbook. In our next lesson, we'll take a look at various ways to run our macro other than the shortcut key. I hope you found that helpful, and thanks for watching. Lesson 3. Running a macro. In this lesson, we'll take a look at various ways to run the macro that you've recorded. You can use the macro dialog, you can use a shortcut key, you can assign it to an icon on the quick access toolbar, or you can run it from a button or any clip art. Well, let's get started. Back in lesson 2, we recorded a macro called Format Blue and put that in the personal macro workbook. Now, if you open lesson 03, you'll see that I've taken that macro from the personal macro workbook and put it here, so that way in case you hadn't worked through lesson 2, you'll still have access to this macro. I want to run the Format Blue macro, and unfortunately, let's say it was a couple months ago, I don't remember exactly what shortcut key I used. One way that we can get a complete list of the macros is to come to either the View tab and choose Macros, View Macros, or on the Developer tab, use the large Macros icon. You'll see in the tooltip that this is also accessible using Alt F8. If you're going to record a lot of macros, there's probably 3 or 4 shortcut keys that you're going to learn. Alt F8 is certainly one of those. If we choose the Macros icon, we're going to get to the Macro dialog box. And the Macro dialog box will have a list of all of the macros that are available to us. Now, you'll see by default it's showing me macros in all open workbooks. And in this case, there's only one macro available. Sometimes, though, I have some projects that I've written for clients where we have 30, 40, 50 macros. And if that workbook happens to be available and open in the background, I just have a massive list of macros here. It's a little frustrating to wade through that list, so sometimes I'll come in here and open this to say macros in this workbook to limit it to only the macros associated with this workbook, or perhaps macros in the personal workbook. A great way to limit and filter this list to see one particular item. Well, one way to run the macro is to actually choose it here and click Run, and Excel will run that macro. If you remember from lesson 2, this macro basically takes the current cell and formats that cell using a certain color combination. Another way to run the macro is the shortcut key. Now, what if we've forgotten the shortcut key, or if we failed to assign a shortcut key when we recorded the macro? Well, again, we're going to come back into the macros dialog and choose the macro, but this time click Options. In the macro options, we can see what shortcut key is currently assigned to the macro, Control-Shift-B, and we can change that shortcut key. If I type Shift-F in there, it'll be assigned to Control-Shift-F. It's a great way to change the shortcut key, or even to assign a shortcut key if you hadn't assigned one when the macro is being recorded. So now I can choose a cell, press Control-Shift-F, and the macro will run. Another way to run the macro is to assign it to an icon. Now, in the old version of Excel, we could put that icon just about anywhere on the standard toolbar, the formatting toolbar. However, in Excel 2007, they've limited us that we can only add icons to the quick access toolbar. Well, we can only add them unless we want to get in and write some XML code. So for now, let's assume that we can only add icons to the quick access toolbar. What is the quick access toolbar? It's this tiny strip of real estate here right above the ribbon. It starts out with icons for save, undo, and redo. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to take that quick access toolbar and move it down below the ribbon. So I'm going to right click on the quick access toolbar and say show quick access toolbar below the ribbon. There's a couple of advantages here. The first advantage is that the icons are now much closer to our worksheet, so they're easier to get to. You'll also notice that we now have the full width of the screen to add icons. Much more room for icons than when it's up here above the ribbon. Okay, so we want to add an icon to the Quick Access toolbar. We're going to right click and say Customize Quick Access Toolbar. It takes us into a certain category in Excel options, the Customize category. And in this case, we're going to open the left drop down and choose Macros. Now, we get a list of all the macros available to us, and you see there's exactly one, the Format Blue macro. So choose that and click Add, and that's going to add this icon to the Quick Access toolbar. It's a little disappointing that we're stuck with this flowchart icon. That's the default icon they use for all of the macros, but we can modify that. Choose the item in the right list box and then choose the Modify button, and you see that you have about 150 different icons to choose from. Certainly not as many icons as we had in Excel 2003, where there were 4,096 different icons, but more icons than the similar dialog box in Excel 2003, where we were limited to perhaps 48 different icons. So we have to choose an icon here. None of them, of course, look exactly like Format Blue. Some of them are more blue, like for example, this cell is blue. The display name, this is the tooltip that will appear. So I can say Mark Cells for Audit. Click OK. And click OK. Now let's see what happens. You'll see that here in our Quick Access toolbar, we now have a brand new icon. If I choose a cell, I hover, it gives me a tooltip, Mark Cells for Audit. When I click that icon, it goes ahead and runs the macro. So adding items to the Quick Access toolbar is a cool way to go. Now I want to show you something that's fairly clever in Excel 2007. In the Customize Quick Access toolbar, I'll remove that and go back to the Macros command. If we wanted this icon to be on the Quick Access toolbar only when this workbook is open, then before we add it to the Quick Access toolbar, we're going to go to the right side and say for Lesson 3. This way, the item is only there when we have Lesson 3 open. So I'm actually going to add a separator, click Add, and then Format Blue, click Add. I'll go in and I'll modify the icon again. I'll choose an icon and type my tooltip. Click OK. Click OK. And now you'll see that the item is there. I've added a separator to break it apart. That icon, however, will go away after I close Lesson 3. So it's a good way to get the icon there when the macro is available, but when the macro is not available, the icon will go away. Another way to run the macro is to assign it to a Forms button. Now the buttons are found on the Developer tab in the Insert drop-down under Form Controls. Let me show you how to add a Forms Control button. You click on the button, and then basically somewhere in your spreadsheet, you're going to draw a rectangular area. It has the wonderful name of Button 1. We'll have a chance to change that. We're going to assign it to the Format Blue macro. Click OK. Now, a couple of things. You want to make sure that before you try and edit the text in the button, that the button is selected. If I would click away from the button's now unselected, and if I would left click on it, it's going to run the macro. So you want to right click on the button to select it. You see the row of dots around the outside that says the button is selected. I can now click that text and type what the button will do, Format Blue. Another interesting thing here is that when I'm typing the text, I'm in text edit mode. In text edit mode, we have a series of diagonal lines around the button instead of the dots. If you would try and format the button now, for example, press Control 1, you only have access to changing the font and the font color. While that might be cool, there's far more options available. And so click on the diagonal lines to change them to dots. Now if we format this, you can either right click and choose Format Control or press Control 1. We have access to many different properties, and we can change the alignment on the button. We can change whether the size is a certain size. We can lock the aspect ratio, and various other properties of the button. This controls whether the button stays where it is or whether it will move in size as we cut and paste rows. So a variety of things we can do here with this button. Click OK. If you assign a button and later need to change it to a different macro, easy enough to do, right-click the button and choose Assign Macro, and you can change which macro is assigned to the button. Click OK. So let's try this out. We choose a cell, click the button, choose a cell, click the button, choose a cell, click the button. You'll see the button is kind of a good way to go for when you're creating a workbook for someone else to use. I mean, if the macro is something that you're going to use all the time, you will remember Control-Shift-F is the way to run the macro. But as we're sending this out to other people for them to use, they'll benefit from having a button there that has a nice description on it. Okay, now one other way to run this macro is similar to using the button, but it turns out that we can actually use any kind of a shape or clip art in order to kick off the macro. So here we have Insert Shapes. We can choose any of these basic shapes. So we can choose maybe an arrow or something like that. Draw the arrow in. Now I want to add a little bit of text here, so I click the text box icon and type Run the Macro. We can do any kind of formatting of this shape, so we can change the outline color. We can change the fill color. And we can even add effects. Now, to run the macro, we're actually going to right-click the shape and again choose Assign Macro and assign this to Format Blue. So again, to test this, we choose a cell, click the shape, choose a cell, click the shape, choose a cell, click the shape. You can get fairly clever here. I've seen many workbooks from many different companies. In one case, they were building a workbook for the sales reps to fill out, and they really wanted to try and make it as friendly as possible. So they actually used some clip art in order to run the macro. So insert clip art. We'll search for run, and we can look for clip art on Office Online. So here's a picture of a runner. We'll copy that clip art. And go back to our spreadsheet and paste. So we now have a nice little bit of clip art there. We can resize that and right click and say Assign Macro. So any picture or clip art or anything on your worksheet can be used to run this macro. Now in the case of this company, they had actually used a picture of a wizard, and basically the wizard was pointing to the right, and they taught people when you click the wizard it will go on and perform the next step. Kind of a clever different way to run the macro. So we have many different ways to run the macro. You can use the macros dialog. Remember, that's Alt F8. That certainly is the most tedious way. You can assign it to a shortcut key. You can assign it to an icon on the quick access toolbar. You can assign it to a button on the worksheet, or actually assign it to a shape or any clip art on the worksheet. So many, many, many different ways to go to run the macro. Well, I hope you found this useful. In the next lesson, we'll talk about using the relative. Lesson 4, the key to successful macro recording. Well, here's the awful truth. The macro recorder, most of the time, does not work. But by watching this lesson, I'll show you the one setting that you can change, so that way your macros will work 95% of the time instead of 5% of the time. Let's get started. Well, in this lesson, I have a list of names and addresses. Now, this is a real story. The lady from the local Chamber of Commerce had called me up one day and she said, "Hey, Bill, I want to do a mail merge. I have data in Excel and I want to create labels in Word. Can you show me how to do that?" And it was a day where I was fairly busy. I didn't have time to go and try and teach this lady how to do a mail merge. And frankly, the whole mail merge process is fairly mystifying. 6 steps, and you have to stand on your head for a few of those steps. I said, why don't you just send me the file and I'll take care of it for you and send you the labels back. And she said, "Oh, that would be great." So now I had made a huge assumption. When this lady said Excel mail merge, I had assumed that she had some clue about how to set data up in Excel to do a mail merge. And the workbook opens up and I have 175 names and addresses in completely the wrong format. If you think about it, the mail merge needs to have name in column A, address in column B, city, state, zip in column C, and I'm thinking to myself, oh no, I'm going to have to do 175 copy and paste transpose in order to solve this problem. And I said, well, wait, wouldn't it be cool if I could write a macro that would solve this problem? And I could write a macro to fix just the first record and then run the macro again and again and again. So let's try this. Let's say that you want to record a macro. So we choose record macro, and I'm going to call it fix one record. Shortcut key. Well, I'm going to reuse Control A. I know that Control A already does something, but Control A is kind of one of my favorite macros because it's easy to hit. And frankly, this is a one-time use macro. I'm going to use it to solve this problem, and then it's going to go away. So because of that, where do I want to store the macro? Well, I don't want to store it in the personal macro workbook. This is a one-time situation. It's not something I want to keep around. And I probably don't want to store it in this workbook because then the macro will be in the file that I send back to the lady. So I'm going to store it, in this case, in a new workbook. All right, I'm about to click OK, so I want to plan out my steps here. I'm starting on the first name. I want to go down and grab that address. I'm going to cut that cell, go up and paste it to B1, and then go down to A3, cut that cell, and paste it to C1. All right, so I know what I'm going to do. Probably after that, I'll delete rows 2, 3, and 4, and make sure that I'm on the name for the next address. That way I can just run the macro again. So we click OK. I see that the macro recorder is running, and I go through and do my steps. I go down to cell A2, I cut, and I paste to B1 with Control V. And then I go down to cell A3, I cut with Control X, use the arrow keys to go up to C1 and paste to C1. Now I need to delete rows 2, 3, and 4. Delete the entire row. And finally, I want to make sure that I'm on that first name. So I press the up arrow key and the down arrow key, and I think I'm ready to roll. I've solved this problem. I've fixed the first record. All I have to do now is press Control A again and again and again, and I'm ready to go. Well, before we can run the macro, of course, we have to stop recording the macro. So we'll click the Stop Recording button down here, and you would think we are ready to go. Here's the sad, sad truth. That macro that we recorded, very simple. I mean, basically, what was it? It was a cut, a paste, a cut, a paste, delete 3 rows, select 1 cell, 6 steps. It was just about as easy as the macro that we recorded in lesson 2. Unfortunately, one very unfortunate default setting that Microsoft sets up makes that macro not work. When we run the macro, here's what the macro recorder is going to do. The macro recorder is so literal, it saw me go to cell A2. So when I run this macro, it's going to go to cell A2 and it's going to cut that cell. And then it's going to paste it to B1 just like I did. Then it's going to go down to A3 and cut that cell and paste it to C1 just like I did. And then it's going to delete rows 2, 3, and 4 and select cell A2. Well, that's a very bad thing, because we're going to be destroying data. I mean, frankly, the macro is only good for fixing the first record. And by the time we've recorded the macro, the first record is actually fixed. Here, let me run the macro. You won't actually see it because it'll happen so fast. But you can see that we are basically destroying data. If I would hold down Control A, I could destroy this entire data set very, very, very quickly. while that's fun to watch, it's definitely not useful. How can it be that Microsoft has a macro recorder that can't handle this simple step? Well, that's a great question. I'm going to close this file without saving. File close. Save changes no. And then we'll reopen that file. It turns out that there is a way to record this macro. Actually, one thing you could do is go back to Lotus 123, any version from 1985 on, when Lotus could record a macro that would solve this problem. The Lotus macro recorder, although it was very limited, was able to record this particular set of steps. It turns out that the setting that we need is something called use relative reference. Use relative reference. If we hover above relative reference, they now provide a fairly nice tooltip here, 3 paragraphs that tell us what's going on. If you're in Excel 2003, the use relative reference button is on the right side of the stop recording toolbar with the only tooltip saying relative reference. Not a good explanation at all. Basically, relative reference is something that we want to use most of the time because it doesn't record that we're going to go to cell A2. It's going to record that we're going to go down 1 cell from wherever we started. So I'll say use relative reference, and now I'll start recording the macro. Again, I'll call it fix1. For the shortcut key, we can't use Control A because that has already been assigned to the workbook that we previously recorded in this lesson. So I'll just use something else. Control S should be easy to hit. And again, we're going to store that in a new workbook. Now you'll notice there's no way to store it in the same workbook that we used in the last example. We're just going to be creating new workbooks here, and that's okay because when we're done, we're going to delete all of those workbooks. We're going to close them without saving, and the macro will just simply go away. Click OK. All right, now we want to make sure that relative reference is on, so I'm just going to go up and do a visual check here. Use relative reference is highlighted, so we're good to go. I'm going to repeat the exact same steps. Notice that you can do this with either the arrow keys or the mouse. It doesn't matter. Either method's going to work. So let's try it with the mouse. We'll go down to A2. I'll cut, and then go up to B1 and paste. I'll try it with the arrow keys. Use the left arrow key, the down arrow key twice. Control X to cut, up 2, right 2, and paste. I'll delete the next 3 rows, and then choose 1 cell, so up arrow key, down arrow key, to make sure I'm on the next name. All right, so now let's press stop, and we'll test this macro. Control S, and we see that that information worked perfectly. Try the next one, worked perfectly. Once we see that it's working, we can just simply hold down Control S and fix all 175 of these records very, very quickly. Certainly much faster than it would have taken for me to go through and fix the records one at a time using paste transpose. So in this lesson, we talked about use relative reference. Most of the time, the macros that I'm recording, I'm going to leave relative reference on all of the time. You'll occasionally find some examples where you need to turn relative reference off for a few steps. Like for example, if we always needed to go back to cell A1 and you don't know how many rows you have, well then you might turn relative reference off for those few steps and then turn it back on for the rest of the macro. It's unfortunate that Microsoft didn't turn this on by default. People would have much better experience recording their first macros and having them work most of the time if relative reference was just simply turned on. You need to pay attention to relative reference. It remembers the settings from before. So if I don't close Excel and I go on to lesson 5, it's going to remember that relative reference is on. So it's not a matter of that you always have to click it. You have to go back. You have to see whether it's on or whether it's off and make sure that it's in the appropriate state for your particular situation. Well, I hope you found this lesson useful. In the next lesson, we'll learn about dealing with a variable number of rows. Lesson 5, variable number of rows. Well, if you think about most data sets that you get, they're going to have a different number of rows from day to day to day. Like an invoice register might have 40 invoices today and 50 invoices tomorrow or 30 invoices the next day. So we need to learn how to record a macro to account for a different number of row differences. And we're going to do this using the end key for navigation. Let's get started. I want to introduce you to a key on your keyboard called the end key. Now, if you haven't used end before, it's a very slick key. It's over on the right-hand side, usually above the arrow keys on a desktop keyboard, in that block of 5 or 6 keys that includes insert, home, and delete. When we press the end key, we're in something called end mode. Now, in Excel 2003, end appeared in the status bar on the lower right-hand side. In Excel 2007, you see down here, it says we are in end mode. And basically, when you're in end mode, the next arrow key that you press is going to jump to an edge of the data. So from cell B2, I'm in end mode. I press the down arrow key. I'm going to go to the last row until it hits a blank. If I would press end and then the right arrow key, I'll jump over to the edge of the data. End up will take me to F2, and end left will take me back to where I started. Now, what if you're already at the last row? So if I'm here at F2, I'm at the edge of the data. If I would press end right again, it's going to jump the gap of blank cells and end up at the next cell that has data. So end right will take me over to column J, end right to the edge of the data, and then end right will take me all the way to column XFD, the edge of the spreadsheet. So the end key is a great way to jump to the edge. Now, just one gotcha that you have to worry about with the end key is the blank cells in the middle of your data cause the end key to stop prematurely, because it stops as soon as it encounters a blank cell. So pressing end and then the down key will stop the blank. We'll have to deal with that outside of the macro recorder. There are ways of dealing with it, but for right now, we're going to assume that our data is a nice contiguous data set all the time. So let's talk about how to record a macro that can jump down to the last row in the data set. I have here 3 different size data sets. Pretend that this is column A from an invoice register on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And I want to record a macro that will go down and find the last row with data, find the next row, and type the word total. My goal here is to record a macro that won't always go to row 17, but will end up wherever the end of the data is. So we're going to turn on the macro recorder. I'll call this add total. Shortcut key of Control Shift T. We'll store it in this workbook. Click OK. Now, of course, we have to make sure that relative reference is on here, and it is. It's still turned on from before. So if you have not been working along with the other lessons, you might want to go to the Developer tab, make sure that relative reference is on. We'll press the end key, the down arrow one more time, and then type the word total and press Control Enter to stay in the current cell. Now let me stop recording here and we'll test our macro. So I'll go to a shorter data set, run Control Shift T, and the total appears exactly where we expect it to. Go to a longer data set, Control Shift T, and the total appears exactly where we want it to. So if you have a data set, nice contiguous data set, you need to get down to the bottom of that data set so you can add some totals, add some other explanatory notes. Using the end key for navigation is a great way to find your way down to the end of the data set. Now let me just show you the one problem here is if you have data that is fairly sparse. Let me say that this data was double spaced for some reason. This macro will not work. If we start here and press Control Shift T, the total does not really reflect the entire data set. When we're able to go in and write our own code, we're actually always going to start at the last row with data. Conceptually, it's going to be either 1048576 or 65536. We'll go to that cell, press the end key, and then the up arrow key and the down arrow key to make sure that we end up at the true end of the data set every time. But for now, as you're recording macros, make sure to always turn on relative reference, use the end key, the down arrow key twice, and you'll be down at the end of the data set where you can start to add your totals. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at actually putting those totals in. One of the other huge gotchas with the macro recorder when we're trying to add totals at the bottom of a data set. You'll learn about that in the next lesson, and I hope that you found this lesson useful. Lesson 6, Adding Totals. Well, okay, there's two major obstacles to having the macro recorder work. We already talked about the first one, relative references. We talked about that in lesson 4. This other one, though, frustrated me for the first 10 years that I was using Excel's macro recorder. The simple fact that the auto sum button cannot be recorded correctly by the macro recorder. This is so frustrating. It's like the guy at Microsoft who programmed the auto sum button and the guy at Microsoft who does the macro recorder. Have they never met at the coffee maker? How can it be that the macro recorder cannot record the concept of using the auto sum button? And like I said, for 10 years, this drove me crazy. I always would have to switch over to VBA and fix this line of code. I finally have a workaround after 10 years of using the macro recorder. So I'm going to pass this along to you in this lesson. Let's get started. All right, so let me set up the situation here. Let's say that we get this file from our IT department every day. It's called, invoice.csv, and we've imported it using a macro. And now we need to go through and do some formatting to this. I think I want to add totals at the last row, and the totals want to be for columns E, F, and G. After I'm done adding the totals, I'm actually going to turn relative references off and go back up to cell A1, so that way I can do some things to the headings. I want to make those headings bold. Once the headings are bold, I'm going to use the auto fit for columns to make the columns wide enough. So that's my whole plan. I kind of have it worked out here in my head exactly how this is all going to fly. Of course, because it's a CSV file, we can trust that we start in cell A1 every time. So I'm going to record the first macro, go to Developer. I'll see that relative reference is turned on, which is good because to get down to that final row, the total row, we need to have relative reference on. So I click Record Macro, and I'll call this Add Totals Take 1. Shortcut key Control-Shift-T, store it in this workbook, that's fine. We'll click OK. All right, so relative is on. I can use the End key like we talked about in lesson 5. Press the End key and the down arrow. That'll get me to the last row. And then one more. We'll type the word total and head over to column E. Now, a cool trick here, this is cool in the regular Excel, is to select all 3 cells before we hit the auto sum button. That'll actually put the totals in a little bit faster. So we go to the Home tab. I use the auto sum button and bam, the totals are in. Life is great. Okay, now, this is the point where I'm actually going to turn off relative recording. Because if you think about it, right now, if I click on cell A1, it's going to say, in a relative fashion, we want to go up 13 rows. Well, tomorrow I might have 20 rows of invoices, and it's not that I want to go up 13, it's that I always want to go back to row 1. There's actually 2 ways to do this. You could use the go-to command to go to row 1, and that will be recorded like an absolute action. But for me, it's just easier to turn off, use relative reference, and then I can come up here and choose A1 to G1. All right, now that I have these selected, I want to make them bold, so I go back and I use the bold icon. And finally, I want to select all cells and use Format Column Auto Fit Selection. So I'll select all cells, and I can either use the shortcut being double-click right here between G and H, or I could go in and use Format Auto Fit Column Width. Either one would have been exactly the same to the macro recorder. All right, so I look at this. My headings are bold. My total's in the right place. I think that I used the correct combination of relative and non-relative. I'm going to stop recording. And frankly, I can't wait until I get Tuesday's file so I can test this out and see how it works. Well, kind of like the cooking shows, when they put one thing in one oven and immediately they have something to get out of the second oven. I already have Tuesday's file here. So we can test this macro out. I'm going to press Control-Shift-T. What I want to see is that the totals are in row 18 and not in row 14. I'll feel good about that. My headings are bold. Everything is the right width. The totals are in the right place. If I wasn't careful, I would feel really good about this result and print it, mail it out to the world. Unfortunately, there's a huge problem. Can you take a look at the screen and tell me what the problem is? There's a couple of clues. All right, do you see it? If you're really good at math, you can size up these numbers right here and see that they really should add up to more than 6.8 million. But, frankly, who's that good at math? But here's the one that you can do. 45 plus 15 plus 12 certainly is not 45. And even better, a cool tip, these little green triangles, frankly, these green triangles drive most of us crazy because most of the time they're warning us about something silly like, oh, this is a number but it's stored as text. Well, okay, yeah, I wanted it stored as text. It's an account number. But in this particular case, that green triangle is actually telling me something very, very useful. It's saying this formula omits adjacent cells. Let's take a look at the formula and see what happened. When we press F2 to edit the formula, basically it's grabbing the 12 rows immediately above the cell. What's up with that? The AutoSum button should go all the way up to the top until it hits a blank cell or a non-numeric cell. But for some reason, this macro, when we played it back, only grabbed the last 12 cells. Why is it doing that? Well, because when we recorded the macro and I was here and I hit the AutoSum button, it grabbed the last 12 cells, and unfortunately, that's what the macro recorder recorded. Hey, we want to grab the last 12 cells. Isn't that insane? I mean, it's one of the most common functions, the AutoSum button, but yet the macro recorder cannot correctly record this. And if you're not careful, you're going to record a macro that is not going to work. As I said, this frustrated me for 10 years. I couldn't figure out a solution to this, and I would always have to go in and look at the code and rewrite that formula so that way the formula would work. But it turns out that there is a way to convince the macro recorder to do the right thing. Let's just take a look at this formula right here. Is there a way that you could write a sum formula that would say go from row 17, the row right above me, but always, always, always go back to row 2. Now, this is kind of a trick question because, frankly, no one would ever type this formula because it would be silly to type this formula. But what I want to do is I want to go from F17, colon, and not to F2, but to $2. The $2. You know, the dollar sign says that that's an absolute reference. So it's saying, hey, we're always going back to row 2 every single time. Now, of course, we would never really do this in real life unless we're recording a macro. It turns out that when you type the formula in that fashion, that is the code to convince the macro recorder to understand what we're trying to do. The macro recorder will understand that we want to go from row 2 every single time to the row right above us. So let's try it again. I'll demonstrate this. I'm going to go on to Wednesday's file and we'll record the same macro. I'll go back to Developer, Record New Macro. I'll call it Add Totals, Take 2, shortcut key. Well, I already used T, so I'm just going to use Control-Shift-R because it's next to the T. Click OK. I want to be careful. I want to make sure relative references are on. Press End, down arrow one more time. Type the word total. I come over here to column E and I want to enter a formula equals sum of E $2 colon E8. I'll press Control Enter to accept that formula and now grab the fill handle to drag it across. Alright, so I've finished my formulas. Remember now, before we go back up to row 1, I want to turn off relative reference, choose those cells, Control B for bold, select all of the cells, and double click between G and H to make all of the columns wide enough. And finally, stop recording. Okay, so now let's see how this works. We'll go to Thursday, where we now have more records again. So as I run this macro, Control-Shift-R, I want to see that the totals end up in row 19, and I want to see that the service revenue comes up to 65,000 instead of 55,000. So here's the test. Control-Shift-R. Take a look at the result. Okay, totals are where I expected them to be. That's great. The total formula here actually works. It goes from F2 to F18. It gets all of the numbers. So, very subtle difference between using AutoSum and typing this formula. If you're using the macro recorder and you want your macros to work, we have to pay attention to relative reference. We also have to remember to never, ever, ever touch the AutoSum button. The macro recorder just is not going to record it correctly, and you're going to end up eventually with the wrong result when you play that macro back on a different size data set. Well, there you have it. The other major annoyance when we're using the macro recorder, the AutoSum doesn't work. You learned today a way to write that formula without using AutoSum, so that way we can record it. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at the Trust Center settings. What happens when we try and open a macro later and play it back, and some options that we have there. I hope you found this lesson useful. Lesson 7. Opening a workbook with macros. In this lesson, we're going to talk about Trust Center settings. The problem that we have is that macros are not automatically enabled when someone opens our workbook, and they're not forced to answer the question. One alternative to this problem is to store the macros in a trusted location. Another alternative is to store the macros in an add-in. Let's get started. Now I'm going to assume for this lesson that you've changed your macro security, as we talked about in lesson 1, to disable all macros with notification. I'm going to open a file that has some macros in it. Previously, in Excel 2003 and earlier, the person opening this workbook would have been forced to answer a question at this point, whether or not they wanted to enable or disable our macros. At least they had a choice. At this point, the macros have been disabled, and the question has been reduced to the info bar. So it's possible for someone to start entering data in the spreadsheet without actually seeing the question of whether they want to enable the macros. This can be very frustrating if you were counting on the workbook open macro to prepare some data for the person. The person actually has to come in and click Options and choose to enable this content. And there you see my message box from the workbook open macro appears. To me, this is not an acceptable solution, requiring the person opening the workbook to actually notice the info bar and go to the info bar. I really want those macros to run all the time. So, one solution that we have is to go into the Trust Center and to set up a trusted location. This is great if the person that you're preparing the macros for, works in the same office as you, and you can get to their computer and you can change these settings. We'll go into Macro Security, and over here on the left-hand side, choose Trusted Locations. Now, typically, there's a few locations that are trusted by default, the template locations, but we're going to add a new location. So I'm going to quickly go into Windows Explorer. I'll press the Windows key and the E key. We'll go into the C drive, and I'll add a brand new folder called, let's call it Bill's Macros. Click OK. And here in the Trusted Locations, I'll add a new location and browse for Bill's Macros. Click OK. Click OK. And now you see that this location is a trusted location. We'll click OK, and I'll save my macro into that folder. I'll save it as a macro-enabled workbook. Navigate to, and we'll call it Lesson 7. Alright, so now I can close the workbook, and when I reopen, this time from the Bill's Macros folder, you see that nothing appears in the information bar, and in fact, my message box from the workbook open macro appears, so this macro is available and ready to run. Well, that solution will work if you have access to the computers of the folks that you're running macros for. Certainly, as I said, if it's in your office or in an office across the street, that's great. But if you're sending this macro out to people around the country or around the world, you're going to have some problems. Another solution is to package the macro as an Excel add-in. Now here's how we'll create an add-in from this macro. We're going to use File, Save As, and add-in is not one of the options available, so we're going to choose Other Formats. In the Save As Type box, look for Excel add-ins. It's a .xlam file, and by default they navigate deep down into the computer. I actually want to move this back to a location where I can find it, so we'll go to C:\data and save it as lesson07.xlam. Click Save. Alright, so we would distribute this file via email, and then on the other side, the people would have to save it in a folder on their computer. It doesn't have to be a trusted folder. And they would then go in and go to Excel Options, go to Add-ins, say that they wanted to manage the add-ins, and browse for the folder. So now Lesson 07 is an installed add-in, and it's available. Now let me just show you what will happen. We'll exit Excel, and every time they open Excel, this macro runs and is available to them without having to answer the macro security question. This behavior is different than it was in Excel 2003. I actually like the Excel 2003 version much better because they're forced to answer the question. Either they're explicitly turning off our macros, which then they don't have the functionality, but at least they knew about it. Here, you get someone who's not experienced with Excel, they don't notice the information bar. The program is not working correctly, the macros are not available, and they don't understand why. So a couple of options for you there. Either set up trusted locations or distribute the workbook as an add-in, and you'll be able to overcome those problems with the info bar. Well, I hope you found that lesson useful. In the next section, we're going to start to talk about the Visual Basic Editor.